Sometimes a man thinks he can outrun his past, build a quiet life where nobody knows his name or what his hands have done. Sometimes a man just wants to tend his cattle and watch the sunset without hearing the echoes of cannon fire in his dreams. 6 outlaws rode toward Elias Boone's ranch that evening, thinking they'd found easy prey. The old hermit living alone in Dead Man's Hollow looked harmless enough, just another broken-down soul hiding in the mountains. They had no idea that 20 years ago, this same man could put a bullet through a silver dollar at 800 yards. They didn't know about Gettysburg, about the 43 confirmed kills that earned him the name Longshot Boone. When his peaceful world gets shattered, will this legendary Civil War sniper let his land be taken? Or will the mountains learn why they called him the deadliest marksman in the Union Army? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like the ghosts of old battles, and Elias Boone stood on his porch watching the sun climb over the jagged peaks of the Montana Territory. At 58, his beard had gone silver white, and deep lines mapped the weathered landscape of his face, each one a story he'd rather forget. His hands, once steady enough to thread a needle at arm's length, now trembled slightly as he lifted his coffee cup. The war had ended 20 years ago, but some wounds never quite healed. His log cabin sat nestled against a granite outcropping, positioned with the tactical awareness of a man who'd learned to sleep with one eye open. 3 escape routes, clear sight lines in all directions, and a root cellar that could serve as a bunker if needed. Old habits died hard, especially when those habits had kept you alive through Shiloh, Antietam, and the hell of Gettysburg. The ranch itself sprawled across 1,000 acres of prime grazing land, fed by a creek that ran crystal clear year-round. Elias had chosen this place carefully after mustering out in 1865, looking for somewhere remote enough that the nightmares couldn't follow. He'd been wrong about that, but the land itself had become a kind of medicine. Working with his hands, building something instead of destroying it, watching new life come into the world every spring when the calves were born. His cattle were good stock, mostly Herefords, with a few Longhorns mixed in for hardiness. 200 head, enough to make a modest living selling beef to the mining camps scattered throughout the territory. He ran the operation alone, except for his dog, a grizzled old blue-tick hound named Sherman, who'd wandered onto the property half-starved 3 winters back. The dog had military discipline in his blood too, somehow, never barked without cause. Always positioned himself to watch Elias's blind spots. The closest neighbor lived 15 miles south, and the nearest town was a 2-day ride through treacherous mountain passes. Elias preferred it that way. In town, people asked questions. They wanted to know about the war, about the scars that crisscrossed his torso like a roadmap of violence. They'd heard stories about a sniper called Longshot Boone, and sometimes they'd get that look in their eyes, half fear, half fascination, when they thought they'd made the connection. But here in Dead Man's Hollow, named for a prospector who'd frozen to death during the brutal winter of '69, Elias could pretend to be just another broken-down veteran trying to make peace with his demons. He kept his Springfield rifle wrapped in oiled cloth beneath the loose floorboard by his bed, along with a leather pouch containing 50 rounds of .58 caliber ammunition, not because he planned to use it, but because a smart soldier never went completely unarmed. The irony wasn't lost on him that his greatest skill, the thing that had made him legendary among the sharpshooters of the Army of the Potomac, was the very thing he now worked hardest to forget. During the war, they'd called him a ghost, a phantom who could appear anywhere on the battlefield and disappear just as quickly. His commanding officers had used him like a scalpel, sending him to eliminate specific targets that regular infantry couldn't reach. Confederate officers, artillery crews, anyone whose death might tip the balance of a particular engagement. 43 confirmed kills. The number haunted him more than the faces, though he remembered every one of those too. Young men mostly, somebody's son or brother or father, cut down by a bullet they never saw coming. He'd told himself it was war, that each shot saved Union lives. But the justifications rang hollow in the quiet hours before dawn, after Appomattox. When Lee surrendered and the guns finally fell silent, Elias had thought the killing was behind him. He'd planned to return to his family's farm in Ohio, maybe find a wife and raise children who would never know the weight of a rifle or the sound of dying men calling for their mothers. But the nightmares had followed him home, and the farm felt too small, too crowded with memories of the boy he'd been before the war taught him how to kill. So he'd headed west with his mustering out pay and a few personal possessions, looking for a place where the past couldn't reach. The Montana Territory was perfect, vast, empty, and unforgiving enough that it demanded all of a man's attention just to survive. He'd bought the land from a territorial agent sight unseen, drawn by the name Dead Man's Hollow and the promise of complete isolation. The first winter had nearly killed him. He'd been soft from too many years of army rations and shared responsibilities, unprepared for the brutal self-reliance that mountain life demanded. But he'd adapted, the same way he'd adapted to sleeping in trenches and eating hardtack, crawling with weevils. By spring, he'd learned to read the weather, to preserve meat, to repair everything from harnesses to roof shingles with nothing but ingenuity and stubbornness. Now, 2 decades later, the ranch ran like clockwork. He rose before dawn, tended the animals, rode fence, and maintained his equipment with military precision. Evenings were spent reading by lamplight, mostly practical books about animal husbandry and crop rotation, though he kept a worn copy of Walt Whitman's poems hidden beneath his mattress. The poet's words about the aftermath of war spoke to something deep in Elias's chest, a wound that had never properly healed. The loneliness was the hardest part, though he'd grown accustomed to it over the years. Conversations with Sherman and the occasional visiting supply merchant were the extent of his social interaction. He'd taught himself to find companionship in the rhythm of seasonal work, in the satisfaction of watching his herd grow healthy and strong. But sometimes, especially during the long winter months, the silence pressed against him like a physical weight. He'd had opportunities for human connection over the years. Sarah McKinnon, the widowed schoolteacher in Copper Falls, had made her interest clear during his infrequent trips to town. She was a handsome woman, intelligent and kind, with laugh lines around her green eyes that spoke of joy rather than just age. But Elias couldn't bring himself to court her, couldn't imagine trying to explain the nightmares that still woke him in cold sweats, the way his hands automatically reached for weapons that weren't there when unexpected sounds broke the morning stillness. What kind of husband would he make? What kind of father? How could he teach children about right and wrong when his own moral compass had been shattered by 4 years of sanctioned killing? Better to remain alone, to let his bloodline end with him, than to pass on the darkness that lived behind his ribs like a caged animal. The cattle lowed softly in the morning air as Elias finished his coffee and prepared to begin another day of purposeful solitude. He didn't know that down in Copper Falls, 6 hard men were asking questions about the hermit who lived up in Dead Man's Hollow. He didn't know they'd been watching his routine, counting his cattle, measuring the distance from his cabin to the nearest help. All Elias knew was that Sherman had been restless lately, whining softly at sounds only he could hear, positioning himself between his master and the horizon in a way that reminded Elias uncomfortably of patrol behavior during the war. The old soldier in him recognized the signs, the way birds had been scarce around the property, the feeling of being watched that raised the hair on his arms when he worked alone in the distant pastures. But he pushed those thoughts aside, as he always did, attributing them to the paranoia that lived like a permanent resident in the minds of men who'd seen too much killing. 20 years of peace had softened him, made him doubt the instincts that had once kept him alive in a world where death came whistling out of clear blue skies. He couldn't have known that his peaceful world was about to shatter, that the careful distance he'd built between himself and his violent past was about to collapse like a house built on sand. As he walked toward the barn to begin his morning chores, Elias Boone had no idea that the most dangerous men in the territory were already planning to take everything he'd built, starting with his life. The war had taught him that the most fatal mistake a soldier could make was assuming the enemy couldn't find him. But 20 years of quiet mornings had made him forget that some lessons can only be learned once, and the price of forgetting them was usually measured in blood. The dust cloud appeared on the eastern ridge, just as Elias was finishing his evening chores. 6 dark figures silhouetted against the dying light like harbingers of trouble. Sherman began growling low in his throat, the sound rumbling up from somewhere deep in his chest, where wild instincts lived. The old dog had never steered him wrong. During the war or after, Elias straightened slowly, his weathered hands still holding the feed bucket. But his eyes were already calculating distances and angles with the automatic precision of a man trained to survive. 6 riders spread out in a loose formation that spoke of military discipline or outlaw cunning. They were still a half-mile away, but something about their approach made the hair on his arms stand up like pine needles in a lightning storm. He set the bucket down carefully and moved to the porch, keeping his movements casual while his mind shifted into the cold, tactical awareness he'd thought buried forever. The riders were taking their time, letting their horses pick their way down the rocky slope with the patience of men who knew their quarry couldn't escape. That patience itself was a message. They weren't worried about him running, which meant they either didn't know who he used to be, or they didn't care. The Springfield rifle was 20 feet away, wrapped in oiled cloth beneath his cabin floor. His Colt revolver hung on a peg just inside the front door, loaded but not chambered, a compromise between preparedness and the hope that he'd never need it again. 20 years of peace had made him careful about keeping live rounds in the chamber, afraid that muscle memory might take over during one of his nightmares and turn dreams into tragedy. Now, watching the riders descend toward his valley like wolves following the scent of blood, Elias wished he'd been less cautious about such things. The war had taught him that the time to prepare for violence was always before you needed to, because once it started, seconds stretched thin as spider silk and every heartbeat could be your last. The leader rode a big bay stallion with white markings, a man who carried himself with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to taking what he wanted. Even at a distance, Elias could read the violence in his posture, the way he sat his saddle like a throne, the casual way his hand rested near his gun. This wasn't a social visit or a case of mistaken directions. This was predators coming to claim territory. Behind him rode 5 others, a mixed collection of hard cases and drifters who'd probably never held honest work longer than it took to steal something more profitable. Elias had seen their type before, during the chaos after the war, when broken men turned to banditry rather than face the slow work of rebuilding their lives. Dangerous because they had nothing left to lose. Unpredictable because desperation made them stupid. Sherman pressed against his leg, still growling, the dog's entire body tense with the knowledge that threat was approaching. Elias rested a hand on the blue tick's grizzled head, drawing comfort from the animal's solid presence. At least he wouldn't face whatever was coming completely alone, though he hoped the dog would have sense enough to run if things turned deadly. The riders reached the bottom of the slope and spread out as they approached the cabin, their formation designed to prevent escape and provide crossfire if shooting started. Military training, or at least someone in their group who understood tactics. That narrowed the possibilities, and none of them were good. Confederate deserters, maybe, or Union soldiers who'd gone bad after mustering out. The kind of men who'd learned to kill efficiently and decided it was easier than learning to live honestly. "Evening," called the leader as they drew within hailing distance. His voice carried the false friendliness of a man trying to put his victims at ease. "You'd be Elias Boone, I'm thinking. We've ridden a fair piece to have words with you." Elias stayed on his porch, keeping his hands visible but ready to move. The tactical part of his mind was already mapping the terrain, identifying cover, calculating how many he could take down if this went bad. Old instincts rose like smoke from banked coals, sharp and familiar despite 20 years of disuse. "Don't get many visitors up here," he replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to sing in his veins. "What brings you gentlemen to Dead Man's Hollow?" The leader smiled, but it was the expression a wolf might wear before separating a lamb from its flock. "Name's Cray Dutton. These are my associates." He gestured to the men flanking him with proprietary confidence. "We've come to discuss a business proposition. Might we step down, share some coffee and conversation?" Every instinct Elias possessed screamed danger, but refusing hospitality in the territory could be seen as an act of aggression. Still, he had no intention of letting armed strangers into his home where they could control the situation completely. "Coffee's gone cold," he said, "but you're welcome to water your horses at the trough. We can talk just fine from where we stand." Dutton's smile widened, showing teeth stained yellow with tobacco. "Suit yourself, old man. Truth is, we've been keeping an eye on your spread here, and we're impressed with what you've built. Fine cattle, good grazing land, water rights that extend clear to the territorial boundary. Must have taken considerable effort to carve a ranch out of this wilderness." 20 years' worth, Elias replied carefully. He could see the other riders shifting in their saddles, hands drifting toward weapons with the unconscious movements of men preparing for violence. Whatever Dutton was building toward, the polite conversation wouldn't last much longer. 20 years, Dutton mused, as if the number had special significance. Long time for a man to work alone, especially a man getting on in years. Dangerous country up here. Bears, mountain lions, accidents that could leave a fellow helpless. Seems to me a man in your position might benefit from some protection. Some partnership with folks who could help ensure his golden years are peaceful ones. The threat was clear now, wrapped in the thin veneer of a protection racket. Elias had seen similar operations during his infrequent trips to town. Gangs of hard men who offered to protect businesses from the very violence they themselves provided. Pay up or face consequences that ranged from vandalism to murder, depending on how stubborn the victim proved to be. "I've managed just fine on my own," Elias said. "Don't see that changing anytime soon." Dutton's false smile faded, replaced by the cold calculation of a predator sizing up prey. "See, that's where you're wrong, old man. Things are changing whether you see it or not. Territory's filling up with folks who understand that cooperation is the key to prosperity. Stubborn holdouts who refuse reasonable partnerships tend to suffer unfortunate accidents." One of the other riders, a scarred man with dead eyes and a tied-down holster, spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Ye boss, we're wasting time with talk. Old hermit like this probably got money hidden all through the cabin. Why don't we just take what we want and be done with it?" Dutton held up a hand, but his eyes never left Elias. "Patience, Wade. Mr. Boone strikes me as a reasonable man who just needs time to consider the wisdom of our proposal. Tell you what, old-timer, we'll give you 3 days to think it over. Come Sunday evening, we'll ride back up here for your answer. I'm hoping you'll see the sense in joining our organization voluntary-like, because the alternative would be unfortunate for everyone involved." The riders began backing their horses away from the cabin, but their formation remained tactical, ready for trouble if Elias made any sudden moves. Dutton touched the brim of his hat in mocking courtesy, the gesture more insult than politeness. 3 days, he repeated. "Don't make us ride all the way back up here just to hear bad news." They wheeled their horses and began the climb back up the eastern slope, dust rising behind them like the promise of approaching storm. Elias remained on his porch until they disappeared over the ridge, his body rigid, with the effort of standing still when every combat instinct screamed at him to take action. Only when the last echo of hoofbeats faded did he allow himself to move, walking with forced casualness to the barn, where he could no longer be observed from the ridgeline. Once inside, he leaned against a stall door and let the reaction hit him, hands shaking, heart racing, the bitter taste of adrenaline flooding his mouth like old pennies. 20 years of peace, shattered in the space of a 10-minute conversation. The careful life he'd built in Dead Man's Hollow, the distance he'd put between himself and the violence of his past, all of it crumbling like sandcastles before the tide. They'd given him 3 days, but Elias knew with the certainty of a man who'd seen too much killing that Sunday would bring blood to his valley, whether he cooperated or not. Men like Dutton didn't leave witnesses to their extortion, especially witnesses who lived alone and wouldn't be missed for weeks. They'd take his cattle, burn his cabin, and bury him in some unmarked grave where the coyotes would scatter his bones. Just another hermit who disappeared in the dangerous wilderness, adding one more ghost to Dead Man's Hollow. Sherman whined softly and pressed against his leg, sensing his master's distress. Elias scratched the dog's ears absently, his mind already shifting into the cold tactical planning that had once made him the most feared sniper in the Union Army. 3 days wasn't much time, but it might be enough if he used every advantage his 20 years of mountain living had given him. As the last light faded from the western peaks, Elias Boone walked back to his cabin and knelt beside his bed. The loose floorboard came up easily, revealing the oiled cloth bundle he'd hoped never to touch again. His hands shook as he unwrapped the Springfield rifle, the metal still bright despite 2 decades of storage. The walnut stock, worn smooth by thousands of hours of practice and use. 44 confirmed kills, he corrected himself silently. Because come Sunday evening, that number was going to change. The war, it seemed, wasn't finished with him yet. The Springfield rifle lay across Elias's kitchen table like an accusation, its familiar weight a reminder of everything he'd tried to leave behind. He'd cleaned and oiled it by lamplight, his hands moving with the muscle memory of countless evenings spent maintaining his weapon during the war. The ritual was both comforting and terrifying, like greeting an old friend who'd helped you do terrible things. Sleep had been impossible after Dutton's visit. Instead, Elias had spent the night cataloguing his resources and planning for what was coming. 3 days wasn't much time to prepare for a war, but he'd survived impossible odds before by being smarter than his enemies and more willing to do what necessity demanded. The first priority was reconnaissance. He needed to understand exactly what he was facing, how many men Dutton really commanded, where they were camped, what their capabilities were beyond the 6 riders he'd seen. Information was ammunition in any conflict, and right now Elias was shooting blind. At first light, he saddled his mare Rosie and rode up to the eastern ridge where the Outlaws had first appeared. The tracks were easy to follow in the soft earth. 6 horses heading northeast toward the Badlands, where a dozen canyons provided perfect hiding places for men who lived outside the law. Sherman trotted alongside, his grizzled muzzle testing the wind for scents that might reveal more than hoofprints could tell. The trail led through a narrow defile between 2 towering rock faces, a natural choke point that made Elias's tactical senses scream warnings. This was the kind of terrain where small forces could hold off larger ones, where a few well-placed riflemen could stop a cavalry charge cold. If Dutton's gang was using these canyons as their base, rooting them out would be like digging hornets from a cliff face, dangerous and likely to get you stung. 3 miles into the Badlands, the trail split. 2 horses had continued northeast, while 4 had turned toward a cluster of mesas that rose like ancient monuments from the desert floor. Elias studied the tracks carefully, reading the story they told. The 2 who'd gone northeast were riding light and fast, scouts probably, sent to keep watch on approaches to whatever stronghold the gang had established. He followed the 4-horse trail toward the mesas, staying well back and using every piece of cover the broken landscape provided. The war had taught him that patience was a sniper's greatest weapon, that rushing into unknown situations was the fastest way to fill a grave. Better to spend hours learning the lay of the land than minutes dying because you hadn't bothered to look before you leaped. The trail led to a natural amphitheater carved from red sandstone, its walls rising sheer on 3 sides with only one narrow entrance. Smoke drifted lazily from somewhere within, carrying the smell of coffee and bacon that made Elias's empty stomach clench with hunger. He'd been so focused on tracking that he'd forgotten to eat breakfast, a mistake that would have gotten him killed during the war. From his position on a rocky outcrop 200 yards away, Elias could see into the gang's camp through the gap between two boulders. More than 6 men were down there. He counted at least 12, maybe 15, which meant Dutton had brought only half his force to the ranch. The rest had stayed behind to guard their base and probably to prepare for whatever violence Sunday would bring. The camp was well organized, which told him this wasn't a ragtag collection of desperate men, but a disciplined outfit with military experience. Cookfires were positioned to minimize smoke visibility. Horses were picketed in a defensive formation, and sentries were posted at intervals that provided overlapping fields of observation. Whoever was running this operation understood tactics and had taught his men to think like soldiers rather than common thieves. Through his field glasses, a pair of Zeiss optics he'd kept from the war, Elias studied the faces below. Most were the hard, weathered countenances of men who'd lived rough and violent lives. But a few looked younger, maybe even inexperienced, which might work to his advantage if shooting started. Green fighters made predictable mistakes, and predictable mistakes got people killed. Dutton himself was nowhere to be seen, which meant he was either inside one of the tents or away on business. The man Elias had heard called Wade was there, cleaning a rifle with the methodical attention of someone who knew his life might depend on its reliability. Several others were gambling with greasy cards, their weapons within easy reach, but not immediately ready for action. The intelligence gathering took most of the morning, but by the time the sun reached its zenith, Elias had a clear picture of what he was facing. 15 men, well-armed and disciplined, occupying a position that was nearly impregnable from direct assault. Attacking them in their stronghold would be suicide, which meant he had to find another way to even the odds. The ride back to his ranch gave him time to think, to consider options, and discard the ones that relied more on luck than skill. His Confederate hunting expeditions during the war had taught him that the key to victory wasn't always superior numbers or firepower. Sometimes it was simply being willing to fight the kind of war your enemy didn't expect. Back at his cabin, Elias spread a hand-drawn map across his kitchen table and began marking positions and distances with the precision of an artillery officer plotting firing solutions. The approaches to his ranch were limited by terrain, which could work for him or against him, depending on how cleverly he used the landscape. Dead Man's Hollow was a natural fortress if defended properly, but it could also become a trap if he wasn't careful about maintaining escape routes. The creek that fed his pastures emerged from a narrow canyon to the north, its walls steep enough to channel attackers into predictable killing zones. The southern approach was blocked by a mesa that rose nearly vertical for 300 feet, leaving only the eastern and western routes as viable avenues of attack. Dutton would probably come from the east, following the same path he'd used for his ultimatum visit, which meant Elias needed to be ready for a frontal assault. But there was another possibility, one that made his blood run cold when he considered it fully. Men like Dutton didn't always fight fair, and burning out stubborn homesteaders was a common tactic among the more vicious gangs. If they decided to simply burn his cabin and shoot him when he ran, all his tactical preparations would be worthless. That realization led to his first major decision. He couldn't defend from inside the cabin. Too many ways to be trapped, too easy to be burned out or smoked out like a badger in its den. He needed a position that offered clear fields of fire, multiple escape routes, and protection from both bullets and fire. The rocky outcrop behind his cabin fit all those requirements, and it had the added advantage of height that would extend his rifle's effective range. Spent the afternoon moving supplies to his chosen defensive position, carrying ammunition, water, and food in small loads that wouldn't be visible from the eastern approach. Sherman helped by carrying a pack loaded with jerky and hardtack, the dog seeming to understand that something important was happening, even if he couldn't grasp the specifics. The hardest part was moving his cattle to safety. 200 head was too many to drive to distant pastures without help, but leaving them in the main grazing area would make them targets for men who might decide to cause maximum damage out of spite. In the end, he settled for driving them into the northern canyon, where they'd have water and grass, but would be protected from casual gunfire by the rocky walls. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Elias made his final preparations. He cleaned his revolver and loaded all 6 chambers, something he hadn't done since mustering out of the army. The Springfield got a final inspection, its action smooth as silk, despite 20 years of storage. 50 rounds of ammunition went into a leather pouch that he could carry easily, though he hoped the fighting wouldn't last long enough to need them all. The last thing he did was write a letter, using his best penmanship to explain what had happened and why. If things went badly on Sunday, someone would eventually find his body and wonder about the circumstances. The letter would tell that story, along with his final wishes for the disposition of his property and animals. He sealed it in an envelope and left it on his kitchen table, where it couldn't be missed. As darkness settled over Dead Man's Hollow, Elias Boone sat on his porch with Sherman beside him and tried to make peace with what was coming. 3 days had seemed like a reasonable amount of time when Dutton had offered the ultimatum, but now it felt like barely enough to prepare for what would probably be the last battle of his life. The war had taught him that no plan survived contact with the enemy, that flexibility and quick thinking often mattered more than superior preparation. But it had also taught him that a man who was willing to die for something he believed in was the most dangerous opponent any enemy could face. Sunday was still 2 days away, but Elias could already smell the gunpowder on the wind. The second day dawned grey and cold, with storm clouds gathering over the peaks like an army preparing for battle. Elias woke from restless sleep, filled with dreams of Gettysburg, of muzzle flashes in the darkness and the wet sound bullets made when they found flesh. His hands were steady as he made coffee, but the tremor in his soul ran deeper than palsy or age could account for. Sherman sensed his master's turmoil and stayed close as Elias went about his morning routine, the dog's brown eyes reflecting a wisdom that came from years of reading human moods. During the war, animals had often been better than officers at predicting when violence was coming. They could smell fear and death on the wind, could sense the change in men when they shifted from thinking about killing to actually doing it. Today's task was the hardest one Elias could imagine, not because of its physical demands, but because of what it represented. He needed to practice with the Springfield rifle to reacquaint his hands and eyes with the weapon that had once made him legendary. 20 years was a long time to go without shooting, and muscle memory alone wouldn't be enough when lives hung in the balance. He'd set up targets at various distances, tin cans at 100 yards, pieces of wood at 200, a white cloth tied to a distant pine at 400. During the war, he'd been able to put 5 shots into a playing card at 300 yards. But those days were gone, along with his youth and the desperate clarity that came from knowing that missing meant watching good men die. The first shot was the hardest. His finger hesitated on the trigger as memories flooded back, the weight of the rifle against his shoulder, the smell of black powder smoke, the way targets turned from abstract shapes into human beings the moment you squeezed metal against metal. But necessity overcame reluctance, and the Springfield roared its familiar thunder across the valley. The bullet struck 2 inches high and 3 inches left of center on the 100-yard target. Not terrible for a first shot after 2 decades, but not good enough for what was coming. Elias adjusted his sight picture and fired again, this time clipping the edge of the tin can and sending it spinning into the grass. Better, but still not the precision he'd need if Dutton brought all 15 men to Sunday's confrontation. By mid-morning, he'd burned through 20 rounds and was beginning to remember the rhythm of long-range shooting. Breath control, trigger squeeze, follow-through. The fundamentals came back like a prayer learned in childhood. Muscle memory written so deep in his bones that time couldn't erase it completely. The 200-yard shots were grouping nicely now, and he'd managed to hit the 400-yard cloth twice out of 5 attempts. But accuracy was only part of the equation. Speed mattered too, and 20 years of ranching had made him methodical rather than quick. During the war, he'd been able to load and fire the single-shot Springfield 6 times per minute, a rate that had allowed him to engage multiple targets in rapid succession. Now, his loading sequence felt clumsy, his hands fumbling with cartridges that should have slid home as naturally as breathing. The practice session stretched into the afternoon, interrupted only by breaks to rest his shoulder and give the rifle barrel time to cool. By the time shadows began lengthening toward evening, Elias had fired 40 rounds and was approaching something like his old proficiency. Not perfect, but good enough to make Dutton's gang pay dearly for whatever violence they brought to his valley. The physical preparation was easier than the mental reconciliation he had to make with what was coming. For 20 years, he'd told himself that the killing was behind him, that he'd hung up his weapons for good when Lee surrendered at Appomattox. The ranch had been his penance, a way of creating life instead of destroying it, of proving to himself that he was more than just a very efficient killer. Now he was cleaning his rifle and counting ammunition like a man preparing for war. And the familiar ritual brought back all the old questions that had haunted his sleepless nights during the conflict. What gave him the right to take another man's life? How did he reconcile the commandment against killing with the necessity of protecting innocent people from predators? Where was the line between justice and murder, and who got to decide which side of it he was standing on? During the war, those questions had been easier to answer. The Confederacy represented slavery, oppression, the idea that some human beings were property to be bought and sold. Fighting against that evil had felt righteous, even when the individual Confederate soldiers he killed were probably decent men, fighting for what they believed was their homeland. The cause had been clear, the moral framework solid enough to bear the weight of 43 confirmed kills. But what about now? Dutton and his gang were thieves and murderers, men who lived by violence and fed on the fear of honest people. Killing them would protect not just himself, but other potential victims, other ranchers and settlers who might face the same ultimatum he'd received. That should make the choice obvious. But 20 years of peace had complicated his moral certainty in ways that 4 years of war never had. The truth. If he was being honest with himself, was that part of him was looking forward to Sunday with an anticipation that shamed him. The part of him that had been Longshot Boone, the phantom sniper who could appear anywhere and disappear without a trace, was stirring in its long sleep like a bear waking from hibernation. That part of him missed the clarity of combat, the way all of life's complications reduced to simple equations of geometry and ballistics. He'd been good at killing, maybe the best the Union Army had ever produced, and excellence in any field brought its own seductive satisfaction. The careful stalking of human prey, the patient hours spent waiting for the perfect shot. The moment when everything aligned and physics took over from human will. There had been a terrible beauty in it that no amount of guilt or regret could completely erase. But that way lay madness. And Elias had seen enough broken veterans to know how that story ended. Men who lived too long in the killing ground eventually lost the ability to live anywhere else, became hollow-eyed ghosts who jumped at sudden sounds and saw enemies in every shadow. He'd sworn 20 years ago that he wouldn't become one of them, wouldn't let the war steal his humanity along with his innocence. The approaching storm finally broke as evening fell, sending cold rain drumming against his cabin roof like the hoofbeats of phantom cavalry. Elias sat by his fireplace with Sherman at his feet, watching flames dance in the grate while thunder rolled across the peaks. Tomorrow would be his last day of peace. The final 24 hours before his carefully constructed world came apart at the seams. He'd done everything he could to prepare tactically, identified firing positions, cached supplies, studied the terrain until he could navigate it blindfolded. But the hardest preparation was the one he was doing now, sitting in the warmth of his cabin while rain washed the mountains clean. He was trying to make peace with the man he used to be, to accept that sometimes the past refused to stay buried no matter how deep you dug the grave. 43 confirmed kills. By Monday morning, that number would almost certainly be higher, and Elias Boone would have to live with whatever that made him for however many years he had left. The rancher in him mourned the necessity, but the soldier in him was already counting ammunition and calculating wind speed. Sherman whined softly and pressed closer to his master's leg, sensing the storm that was coming from more than just the clouds overhead. Outside, the rain continued its ancient percussion against stone and timber, washing away the last traces of the peaceful life that Elias had built in Dead Man's Hollow. Tomorrow, he would climb up to his firing position and wait for Cray Dutton to keep his promise. And when the killing started, Elias would discover whether 20 years of peace had changed him as much as he'd hoped, or whether some things were written too deep in a man's bones to ever be erased. Sunday dawned clear and cold, the storm having passed in the night like a fever breaking. Elias woke before first light with the automatic precision of a soldier who'd learned that sunrise often brought death riding hard behind it. His hands were steady now, the tremor of the past 2 days burned away by the approaching certainty of violence. When a man knew he might die before sunset, small anxieties had a way of disappearing like smoke in a strong wind. He made coffee and bacon with deliberate care, eating slowly despite the knot in his stomach. During the war, he'd learned that a fighting man needed fuel for what was coming, that an empty belly could make steady hands shake at the worst possible moment. The food tasted like sawdust, but he forced it down anyway, washing it with coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Sherman watched from his place by the door, brown eyes alert and ears pricked forward as if he could hear something his master couldn't. The old dog had been restless all night, padding around the cabin and whining softly whenever thunder rolled across the peaks. Now he sat perfectly still, every instinct focused on the eastern approach where danger would come riding with the sun. By full daylight, Elias had loaded his final supplies onto a pack frame and begun the climb to his chosen firing position. The rocky outcrop behind his cabin rose 200 feet above the valley floor, its summit offering clear sight lines in all directions while providing natural cover from return fire. During the war, he'd learned that elevation was a sniper's best friend. It extended range, improved accuracy, and made escape routes more difficult for enemies to predict or block. The position he'd selected was a natural fortress carved from granite by 1,000,000 years of wind and weather. A cluster of house-sized boulders formed a rough circle with gaps just wide enough for rifle barrels, while smaller rocks provided rests for steady shooting. Water seeped from cracks in the stone, forming a small pool that would keep him supplied even if the fight lasted hours. Most importantly, 3 different routes led down from the summit, each one hidden from observers below and leading to different sections of the surrounding wilderness. He spent the morning hours arranging his gear with military precision, placing ammunition pouches within easy reach, checking his field of fire from each shooting position, and memorizing the distances to prominent landmarks. The eastern approach, where Dutton would most likely appear, lay 400 yards away, across open ground, maximum effective range for the Springfield rifle. But well within his capabilities, if his 20 years of practice held true. The waiting was always the hardest part. During the war, he'd spent countless hours in similar positions, watching empty landscapes through his telescopic sight while time crawled past like a wounded animal. Patience was a sniper's greatest weapon, but it was also the most difficult one to master. Every shadow that moved could be an enemy scout. Every distant sound might herald the approach of death, and the mind had a way of conjuring threats from nothing but wind and imagination. By midday, the sun had climbed high enough to turn the valley into a furnace of reflected heat and dancing mirages. Elias rationed his water carefully, knowing that dehydration could ruin his shooting as surely as fear or exhaustion. He'd positioned himself in the shadow of the largest boulder, but even there, the heat was becoming oppressive. Summer in the Montana Territory was no gentle season, and men had died from the sun as often as from bullets. Sherman had followed him up to the firing position, despite Elias's attempts to make him stay at the cabin. The dog lay panting in whatever shade he could find, occasionally lifting his grizzled head to test the wind for scents that might reveal approaching danger. His presence was both a comfort and a worry. Elias didn't want the old blue tick caught in crossfire if shooting started. But he also knew that Sherman's senses were sharper than any human's and might provide early warning of attack. The first sign of trouble came just after 2 o'clock, when Sherman's ears pricked forward and he began growling low in his throat. Elias followed the dog's gaze toward the eastern ridge and saw what had caught his attention: a dust cloud rising against the afternoon sky, still miles away, but moving steadily toward Dead Man's Hollow. Too much dust for a single rider or even a small group, which meant Dutton was bringing his full force to this final confrontation. Through his field glasses, Elias counted the approaching riders as they crested the ridge and began their descent into his valley. 15 men, just as his reconnaissance had suggested, spread out in a loose formation that spoke of military discipline and tactical awareness. They weren't charging blindly toward his cabin, but moving with the careful precision of soldiers advancing under fire, which meant at least some of them understood what they were facing. Dutton rode at the center of the formation on his big bay stallion, close enough now that Elias could see the confident expression on his weathered face. The outlaw leader showed no signs of concern or caution, which suggested he either didn't know about Elias's military background or didn't consider it a significant threat. That overconfidence might be the only advantage Elias possessed, and he intended to use it for everything it was worth. The gang spread out as they approached the cabin, some riders heading toward the barn, while others positioned themselves to cover the main building from different angles. Their movements were coordinated, almost choreographed, which confirmed Elias's suspicion that this wasn't their first raid on an isolated homestead. They'd done this before, perfected their technique through practice on other victims who hadn't been able to fight back effectively. But those other victims hadn't been Longshot Boone, the Union ghost who'd killed 43 Confederate soldiers without ever missing his intended target. And Elias settled behind his rifle and began calculating wind speed and bullet drop. 20 years of peaceful ranching fell away like a shed skin. The man who emerged from that transformation was cold, precise, and utterly without mercy for those who threatened innocent life. He watched through his telescopic sight as Dutton dismounted near the cabin porch, his movements casual and unhurried. The outlaw leader was clearly enjoying this moment, savoring the anticipation of easy victory over a helpless old man. 2 of his riders had already begun examining the barn, while others checked the corrals and outbuildings, looking for signs of resistance or hidden wealth. Boone! Dutton's voice carried clearly across the 400 yards that separated them. "Time's up, old man. Come on out and we'll discuss terms like civilized folks. No need for this to get unpleasant if you're reasonable about things." Elias didn't respond, partly because he was too far away to be heard clearly, but mostly because he was busy making final adjustments to his rifle sight. The wind was coming from the northwest at about 5 miles per hour, which would require a slight correction to his aim point. The range was 410 yards by his estimation, well within the Springfield's capabilities, but demanding absolute precision if he wanted to make his first shot count. Through his scope, he could see Dutton growing impatient as seconds ticked by without response. The outlaw leader began walking toward the cabin, his hand resting on his gun butt in a gesture that was half threat and half nervous habit. Behind him, his men were taking positions that would give them overlapping fields of fire if their quarry tried to run or fight. "Last chance, Boone," Dutton called out, his voice carrying an edge of anger now. "Either you come out talking or we come in shooting. Your choice, but either way, this ends today." Elias took a deep breath and let half of it out, settling his crosshairs on the center of Dutton's chest. His finger found the trigger with the familiarity of an old friend, applying steady pressure until the weapon was balanced on the very edge of firing. 20 years of peace were about to end with a single squeeze of metal against metal. and there would be no taking it back once the bullet left the barrel. The last thing he did before firing was whisper a prayer, not for divine intervention or protection, but for the souls of the men he was about to send into whatever darkness waited beyond the grave. Then Longshot Boone squeezed the trigger, and the mountains echoed with thunder that had been silent for too long. The Springfield's roar rolled across Dead Man's Hollow like the voice of God pronouncing judgment, and Craig Dutton dropped to the ground with a hole through his chest the size of a silver dollar. For a heartbeat, the world seemed frozen in that moment between cause and effect, the other outlaws staring in shock at their leader's sudden collapse. Then chaos erupted as 14 desperate men realized they were under attack from an enemy they couldn't see. Elias was already reloading before Dutton's body finished falling, his hands moving with mechanical precision through the loading sequence he'd practiced 10,000 times during the war. Cartridge from the pouch, tear the paper with his teeth, pour the powder down the barrel, ram home the bullet, cap the nipple, cock the hammer. 12 seconds from shot to shot, fast enough to engage multiple targets before they could organize a response. The outlaws scattered like quail, some diving for cover behind the cabin while others sprinted toward their horses. But there was no cover from an elevated sniper position, no angle that couldn't be exploited by a marksman who understood ballistics and had the patience to wait for clean shots. Elias tracked the nearest runner through his telescopic sight, leading him like a hunter following a deer, and squeezed the trigger when geometry and timing aligned perfectly. The second man went down with a bullet through his spine, his rifle flying from nerveless fingers as he collapsed face first in the dust. That made 2 confirmed kills in less than 30 seconds, and the psychological effect on the surviving gang members was immediate and profound. These weren't soldiers trained to function under fire. They were predators accustomed to hunting helpless prey, and being hunted themselves was breaking their nerve faster than bullets could break their bodies. Sniper! Someone screamed from behind the cabin. Jesus Christ, there's a sniper up in them rocks. Wade, the scarred gunman Elias had noticed during his reconnaissance, was trying to rally the others with the harsh authority of a man who'd served under fire before. Spread out, you cowards! Find cover and return fire! He's just one old man with a rifle. But finding cover was easier ordered than accomplished when the enemy held the high ground and had clear sight lines across the entire valley. The outlaws were pinned in the open with nowhere to run, except back up the eastern slope they'd descended so confidently an hour earlier. And running uphill across broken ground while a skilled marksman picked targets at his leisure was a recipe for massacre rather than escape. Elias took his time selecting the third shot, watching the outlaws scramble for position while he calculated angles and distances. A man named Peters, he'd heard Wade shout the name, was trying to work his way around the cabin's western wall, probably hoping to find a spot where the building would block the sniper's line of sight. But Elias had planned for that possibility, positioning himself where every approach to his cabin remained visible and vulnerable. The third bullet caught Peters in the leg as he sprinted across a 20-foot gap between the cabin and the barn. Not a killing shot, but enough to send him tumbling into the dirt where he lay screaming and clutching his shattered thigh. The wound would cripple him permanently if he survived the day, but Elias felt no more compassion for the outlaw than he had for Confederate soldiers during the war. Men who lived by violence had no right to complain when violence found them in return. 3 shots, 3 hits, and the gang's cohesion was beginning to crumble like a dam under too much pressure. Some of the outlaws were returning fire now, their bullets whining harmlessly off the granite boulders that protected Elias's position. The range was too great for accurate pistol work, and only 2 of them carried rifles, with anything approaching the Springfield's reach and precision. But numbers still mattered, and 11 remaining enemies were enough to overwhelm one sniper if they could coordinate their movements and pin him down with covering fire. Wade seemed to understand this, and his voice cut through the chaos like a cavalry officer organizing a charge. Tommy, Jake, you boys work around to the south side of that hill. Billy, take 3 men and circle north. Rest of you keep that bastard's head down with everything you got." It was good tactics from a man who clearly understood warfare, and it might have worked against a lesser marksman or someone without Elias's intimate knowledge of the terrain. But Longshot Boone had been fighting outnumbered battles for 4 years, had learned to use enemy aggression against itself by making their boldness into a liability rather than an asset. The fourth shot took Tommy in the chest as he tried to flank south, the heavy .58 caliber bullet punching through his ribs and dropping him in a heap beside a fallen log. Jake, seeing his partner's fate, lost his nerve completely and began running back toward the horses in full panic. Elias let him go. A man in full retreat was no immediate threat, and ammunition was too precious to waste on fleeing cowards. The northern flanking party was moving with more discipline, using boulders and brush for cover as they worked their way around the base of the outcrop. But they had to cross 200 yards of open ground to reach the rocky slope that led to Elias's position, and crossing open ground under sniper fire was one of the most dangerous things infantry could attempt. The war had taught Elias that patient marksmen could break entire companies by forcing them to advance across. Killing fields where every step might be their last, he shifted his rifle to recover the northern approach, watching through his scope as 3 men prepared to make their dash. Billy was in the lead, a young man with desperate courage written in every line of his body. Behind him came 2 others, whose names Elias didn't know, but whose fate he could predict with mathematical precision. The 5th shot caught Billy center mass as he broke from cover, spinning him around like a child's top before dropping him motionless in the grass. The 2 men behind him froze, their nerve finally breaking completely as they realized that crossing those 200 yards would be tantamount to suicide. One of them threw down his rifle and began running toward the horses, while the other simply sat down behind his boulder and refused to move, despite Wade's shouted curses. In less than 5 minutes, Longshot Boone had killed 4 men and broken the spirit of at least 3 others. The gang that had ridden so confidently into Dead Man's Hollow was disintegrating under precision fire from an enemy they couldn't locate, couldn't suppress, and couldn't escape. Wade was still trying to maintain order, but his voice carried the edge of panic now as he realized that his carefully planned raid had turned into a slaughter. "Fall back," he finally shouted, abandoning any pretense of completing their mission. "Get to the horses and fall back." But retreat under fire was even more dangerous than advance, and Elias had positioned himself to command the approaches to where the gang had tied their mounts. The horses were 450 yards away across open ground, well within the Springfield's effective range and perfectly exposed to plunging fire from the elevated position. Any man who tried to reach those animals would have to cross the most dangerous piece of real estate in the Montana Territory. The 6th shot took down another runner, a bearded man whose name Elias had never learned, but whose death sent the remaining outlaws into complete panic. Some were crying now, calling for their mothers or begging God for mercy they'd never shown their own victims. Others were simply frozen with terror, unable to advance or retreat. Pinned in place by the certain knowledge that movement meant death, Wade was made of sterner stuff, his military training asserting itself even in the face of catastrophe. He began crawling toward the horses on his belly, using every scrap of available cover to mask his movement. It was good fieldcraft from a man who understood that sometimes survival required abandoning pride and fighting like an animal rather than a soldier. But Elias had been watching Wade specifically, recognizing him as the most dangerous of the surviving outlaws and the one most likely to rally the others if given the chance. Through his telescopic sight, he tracked the scarred gunman's progress across the broken ground, waiting for the moment when tactics would force him into the open. That moment came when Wade reached a dry creek bed that ran within 50 yards of the horses. To reach the animals, he had to cross that gap in the open, and no amount of stealth could make a man invisible when a skilled sniper had him in his sights. Elias took careful aim, compensating for the increased range and the tricky wind patterns that swirled around the base of the outcrop. The seventh shot ended Wade's war permanently, the bullet striking him just below the left shoulder blade and exiting through his chest in a spray of blood and bone fragments. He managed 3 more steps before collapsing face first in the dirt, his rifle falling from dead fingers as the last of his strength bled away into the Montana soil. With their leader and their most competent fighter both dead, the remaining outlaws lost whatever cohesion they'd managed to maintain. Some began running wildly toward the eastern ridge, abandoning their horses and weapons in favor of pure flight. Others simply threw down their guns and raised their hands, hoping that surrender might save them from the ghostly marksman who turned their easy raid into a nightmare. Elias held his fire as the survivors fled or surrendered, not from mercy, but from tactical practicality. His ammunition was limited, and wasting bullets on broken men served no purpose beyond satisfying a bloodlust he refused to indulge. 7 confirmed kills in less than 10 minutes, more than enough to send a message that would echo through every outlaw camp in the territory. As dust settled over the battlefield that had been his peaceful ranch, Elias Boone remained in position behind his rifle, watching for signs that the fight might continue. But the silence that followed was complete and final, broken only by the moans of wounded men and the distant sound of fleeing horses carrying the survivors back toward whatever holes they'd crawled out. Longshot Boone had returned from his 20-year retirement, and Dead Man's Hollow had earned its name once again. The silence that followed the gunfire was deafening, broken only by the moans of wounded men and Sherman's anxious whimpering from his position beside the largest boulder. Elias remained behind his rifle for another 10 minutes, scanning the valley through his telescopic sight for any sign that survivors might be regrouping for another assault. But the broken remnants of Dutton's gang had scattered to the winds, leaving only bodies and blood to mark their passage through Dead Man's Hollow. When he was certain the immediate threat had passed, Elias began the careful descent from his firing position, carrying the Springfield at the ready and pausing frequently to check his surroundings. 20 years of peace had made him cautious about assuming victory too quickly. Dead men sometimes had friends, and those friends occasionally possessed both the skill and determination necessary for revenge. Sherman bounded down the rocky slope ahead of him, the old dog's excitement evident in every movement. Battle had awakened something primal in the blue tick's nature, some ancestral memory of hunting dangerous prey alongside human partners. But as they approached the first body, Cray Dutton, lying sprawled in the dust beside Elias's cabin porch, Sherman's enthusiasm faded into the careful alertness of an animal sensing something wrong with the world. Dutton was definitely dead, the .58 caliber bullet having done its work with surgical precision. But as Elias knelt beside the outlaw leader's body, something glinted in the afternoon sunlight that made his blood run cold. A small medallion hung from a leather cord around Dutton's neck, its brass surface tarnished but still recognizable after all these years. The seal of the 5th Virginia Infantry, Confederate States of America. With trembling hands, Elias pulled the medallion free and turned it over. Engraved on the back in faded script were the words, Cray Dutton, Company C, 5th Virginia, Gettysburg, July 1863. Below that, in smaller letters that required squinting to read, for my brother Marcus, KIA Pickett's charge. The world seemed to tilt sideways as memory crashed over Elias like a breaking wave. July 3rd, 1863, the final day of the Battle of Gettysburg. He'd been positioned in the rocks above Cemetery Ridge, watching through his telescopic sight as 15,000 Confederate soldiers emerged from the tree line for what would become known as Pickett's charge. Somewhere in that gray tide of humanity had been a young soldier named Marcus Dutton, marching toward his death with the desperate courage of men who knew they were walking into hell. Elias had fired 17 shots during that charge, each one carefully aimed at Confederate officers whose deaths might help break the assault before it reached the Union lines. 17 shots, 17 hits, 17 men who would never see another sunset. But he'd never known their names, never thought of them as anything more than targets whose elimination served the greater good of ending the war. Now, staring at the medallion in his palm, he wondered if one of those 17 bullets had found Marcus Dutton's heart. Had he unknowingly killed the brother whose memory had apparently driven Cray Dutton to a life of violence and crime? The irony was so perfect, so cruelly symmetrical, that it felt like the hand of God arranging pieces on some cosmic chessboard where pawns never understood the larger game being played. A groan from the direction of the barn drew his attention, away from the medallion and its terrible implications. Peters, the outlaw who'd taken a bullet in the leg, was still alive and apparently conscious. Military protocol from the war demanded that he check on wounded enemies, both for intelligence purposes and because leaving men to suffer needlessly violated even the harsh code of combat that had governed his actions as a sniper. Peters was lying where he'd fallen, his hands pressed against the wound in his thigh, while blood seeped steadily between his fingers. The bullet had shattered his femur and severed at least one major artery, which meant he'd bleed to death within the hour unless he received medical attention. But the nearest doctor was 2 days' ride away, and Peters wasn't going to survive that kind of journey even if Elias had been inclined to help him. "Water," the wounded outlaw whispered when he saw Elias approaching. "Please, just a drink of water." Elias fetched a canteen from his pack and knelt beside the dying man, lifting his head gently so he could drink without choking. It was a small mercy, but mercy nonetheless, the kind of compassion he'd shown to wounded Confederate soldiers during the war, regardless of which uniform they wore. Death made equals of all men, and the least he could do was ease their passage when possible. "You're him, ain't you?" Peters asked weakly, water trickling down his chin. "Longshot Boone. Cray said you might be, but none of us believed it. Said the ghost sniper was just a story, something the Union boys made up to scare us rebels." "The war's been over for 20 years, Elias replied quietly. "I'm just a rancher now." Peters managed a bitter laugh that turned into a cough flecked with blood. "Rancher hell! You just killed 7 men in 10 minutes with a rifle that's older than some of their horses. That ain't ranching, that's professional killing." He paused to catch his breath, his face growing paler by the moment. "Cray's been hunting you for near 15 years, ever since he figured out who you really were." The words hit Elias like physical blows. "Hunting me? What are you talking about?" "His brother Marcus," Peters whispered, his voice growing weaker. "You killed him at Gettysburg. Shot him right through the heart just as he reached the Union lines. Cray saw it happen, saw his little brother fall with your bullet in him. Been carrying that hate ever since, following rumors and stories, trying to track down the ghost who destroyed his family." The medallion felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in Elias's pocket. "How could he know it was me specifically?" "There were dozens of Union snipers at Gettysburg." Peters smiled weakly, blood staining his teeth. "You signed your work, Longshot. Always put your bullets right through the heart, never wasted shots on arms or legs. Marcus had a hole in his chest the size of a silver dollar, same as Cray's got now. Same as all them other boys you killed during the charge." His eyes were beginning to glaze over as shock and blood loss took their toll. "Cray spent years learning your habits, your tactics, the way you thought. Said when he finally found you, he was going to make you pay for every drop of Dutton blood you spilled." The dying Outlaws revelation hit Elias harder than any bullet could have. For 20 years, he'd assumed his past was buried, that the ghosts of war had no way to follow him into his peaceful exile. But vengeance had a longer memory than peace, and somewhere in the chaos after Appomattox, Cray Dutton had sworn an oath that brought him inevitably to Dead Man's Hollow. The cattle rustling, the protection racket, Elias said, more to himself than to Peters. That was all just a cover story. "He came here specifically to kill me," Peters nodded weakly. "Said he wanted you to know why you were dying before he pulled the trigger. Wanted you to understand that every choice has consequences." Even 20 years later, his breathing was becoming shallow and rapid. "Guess he never figured you'd be the one doing the killing instead." The outlaw died quietly, a few minutes later, his last breath escaping in a soft sigh that seemed to carry years of accumulated pain and bitterness. Elias closed the dead man's eyes and sat back on his heels, trying to process the magnitude of what he'd learned. This hadn't been a random encounter. With frontier criminals, it had been a carefully orchestrated revenge plot, 15 years in the making. Every aspect of Dutton's approach suddenly made sense through this new lens. The initial ultimatum hadn't been about extortion at all, but about drawing Longshot Boone out of hiding and confirming his identity. The 3-day deadline had been designed to give Elias time to prepare, because Dutton wanted a real fight rather than simple assassination. He'd wanted to face the legendary Union sniper at full strength, to prove that Confederate courage could triumph over Yankee precision when the odds were equal. But the odds had never been equal, because Cray Dutton had been fighting the past while Elias was defending the present. The young Confederate soldier who'd watched his brother die at Gettysburg had spent 20 years nurturing his hatred until it consumed everything else, while the Union sniper had tried to build something better from the ashes of war. One path led to growth and healing, while the other led inevitably to the graveyard that Dead Man's Hollow had become. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Elias Boone stood among the bodies of men who died because of choices made during a war that ended before some of them were born. The cycle of violence that began with a single shot at Gettysburg had finally completed itself in this remote Montana valley, leaving 7 more ghosts to haunt the conscience of a man who'd thought himself beyond the reach of his past. But perhaps that was the real lesson of war, that no one ever truly escaped it, that every bullet fired in anger created ripples that spread outward through generations like rings on a pond. The only choice was whether those ripples would be allowed to continue spreading, or whether someone would finally be strong enough to break the cycle and choose peace over vengeance. Tomorrow, Elias would have to decide which kind of man he truly was. The evening shadows grew long across Dead Man's Hollow as Elias sat on his porch staring at the Confederate medallion that had turned his world upside down. 7 bodies lay scattered across his ranch, like accusations written in blood, each one representing a choice he'd made 20 years ago during a war that had shaped every moment of his life since. Sherman lay at his feet, occasionally whining softly as if sensing his master's turmoil, but offering the only comfort available in a world suddenly stripped of moral certainty. The practical tasks of aftermath had taken most of the afternoon. He'd gathered the weapons and horses left behind by Dutton's gang, secured the bodies to prevent scavengers from disturbing them, and tended to the minor wounds he'd sustained during his hurried descent from the firing position. But the hardest work was happening inside his head, where 20 years of carefully constructed peace was crumbling under the weight of revelations that changed everything he thought he knew about himself. Marcus Dutton. The name meant nothing to him beyond what Peters had revealed, but somewhere in his memory lay the moment when a young Confederate soldier had fallen to his rifle during Pickett's charge. 17 shots fired, 17 lives ended, and now he knew that at least one of those deaths had created a cycle of vengeance that stretched across decades and thousands of miles to bring violence to his doorstep once again. The terrible symmetry of it was almost biblical in its implications. He'd killed Marcus Dutton to help end a war, only to have that killing spawn new violence that claimed 7 more lives before running its course. How many other brothers, fathers, sons had he created during 4 years of military service? How many other Cray Duttons might be out there somewhere, nursing decades-old grudges and planning elaborate revenge schemes against the ghost sniper who destroyed their families? The questions multiplied like shadows as the sun continued its descent toward the western peaks. Every confirmed kill during the war had been carefully documented in his service record. 43 names, ranks, and units, each one representing a human being who died because Longshot Boone possessed the skill to put bullets exactly where they needed to go. 43 families who'd received word that their loved ones weren't coming home. 43 potential sources of the kind of hatred that had driven Cray Dutton to 15 years of patient hunting. But dwelling on such thoughts led nowhere except madness. And Elias had seen too many broken veterans to allow himself that luxury. The dead were dead, and no amount of guilt or regret could bring them back or undo the choices that had put them in the ground. All he could do was try to understand what those choices meant and how they should influence the decisions he faced going forward. The immediate decision involved the 4 outlaws, who'd survived the battle but hadn't fled the territory entirely. Through his field glasses, he'd spotted them making camp about 3 miles up the eastern ridge, far enough away to avoid immediate confrontation, but close enough to keep his ranch under observation. They were probably trying to decide whether to continue their mission, attempt to recover their dead companions, or simply disappear into the wilderness and hope Longshot Boone didn't come hunting for them. Under normal circumstances, Elias would have been content to let them go. They'd learned a hard lesson about the price of threatening innocent people, and the survivors would spread word throughout the criminal community that Dead Man's Hollow was defended by something far more dangerous than an aging hermit. But these weren't normal circumstances, because the revelation about Marcus Dutton had changed the entire context of the confrontation. If Cray Dutton had spent 15 years planning this revenge, he wouldn't have trusted such an important mission to a single group of hired guns. There were probably backup plans, secondary teams, contingencies designed to ensure that Longshot Boone paid the ultimate price even if the primary assault failed. The 4 survivors camping on the eastern ridge might be preparing to implement one of those contingencies, which meant the danger to Elias hadn't ended with the afternoon's battle. But there was another possibility that troubled him even more deeply. What if other members of the Dutton family were out there somewhere, carrying the same burden of hatred that had driven Cray to this remote valley? Brothers, cousins, sons who might take up the vendetta where their kinsmen had left off? The cycle of vengeance that had brought violence to Dead Man's Hollow might have only completed its first revolution, with more death and suffering waiting in the years ahead. The thought of spending the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, waiting for the next revenge-driven killer to track him down, was almost unbearable. He'd come to Montana Territory specifically to escape the violence of his past, to build something peaceful and constructive that might balance the scales against all the destruction he'd participated in during the war. Now it seemed that peace had been nothing more than an illusion, a temporary respite before the ghosts of Gettysburg finally caught up with him. As full darkness settled over the valley, Elias made his decision with the same cold calculation that had once made him legendary among Union sharpshooters. The 4 survivors camping on the ridge represented unfinished business, loose ends that could unravel everything he'd tried to build over the past 20 years. They'd seen his face, knew his capabilities, could identify him to other enemies who might come seeking revenge for Marcus Dutton's death. Allowing them to escape would be a tactical mistake that could cost him everything in the months or years ahead. But hunting them down would require him to become something he'd spent 2 decades trying not to be, a cold-blooded killer who struck from the shadows without mercy or hesitation. It would mean abandoning any pretense that he was still the peaceful rancher who'd built a life of quiet dignity in Dead Man's Hollow. Once he crossed that line again, there would be no coming back, no returning to the comfortable fiction that Longshot Boone was just a memory from a war long ended. The preparations began after midnight, when the survivors' campfire had burned down to glowing embers, and their sentries were fighting the drowsiness that came with the small hours of morning. Elias moved through his cabin like a ghost, gathering the equipment he'd need for what military manuals euphemistically called a reconnaissance in force. Black clothing to blend with the darkness, soft-soled moccasins that would move silently across rocky ground, and the knife he'd carried during the war, a 10-inch blade designed for efficiency rather than mercy. He left the Springfield rifle behind, Not because he doubted its effectiveness, but because this mission required stealth rather than long-range precision. 4 men in a defensive position couldn't be eliminated by a single marksman without alerting survivors to the threat, and alerting them would defeat the entire purpose of the operation. This had to be quiet, quick, and absolutely final if it was going to solve the problem rather than simply postponing it. Sherman wanted to follow, sensing that his master was embarking on something dangerous and important. But Elias made him stay at the cabin with gentle but firm commands. The old dog had already risked enough during the afternoon's battle, and what was coming would be too dangerous for any companion who couldn't understand the necessity of absolute silence. This was work for Longshot Boone alone, the kind of solitary violence that had made him legendary during the war. The climb up the eastern ridge took 2 hours of careful movement across terrain that could betray him with a single misplaced step. Every shadow might conceal a sentry, every sound might alert enemies to his approach. But 20 years of mountain living had taught him to move through wilderness as quietly as a hunting cat, and his military training provided the tactical awareness necessary to avoid detection by men who were tired, demoralized, and unprepared for a counterattack from someone they assumed was content to remain in his defensive position. By 3 o'clock in the morning, he was close enough to their camp to hear individual voices and smell the lingering smoke from their fire. 4 men, just as his earlier observation had suggested, huddled around the dying embers and talking in whispers about what they should do next. Their conversation confirmed his suspicions. They weren't planning to abandon their mission, but rather to wait for reinforcements. The Cray Dutton had apparently arranged as a contingency measure. Boss said if something went wrong, we was to hole up and wait for his cousin Jake to arrive with the boys from Colorado, one of them was saying. Jake's supposed to be here by Wednesday with 8 more guns, all of them experienced with this kind of work. Another voice responded with nervous uncertainty. That was before we saw what that old bastard could do with a rifle. Jake don't know he's going up against Longshot Boone himself. Maybe we ought to ride out and warn him off before he gets himself killed too. Jake Dutton don't scare easy, the first speaker replied. Been hunting Union veterans since the war ended, settling scores for boys who died at places like Gettysburg and Antietam. He'll want a crack at the ghost sniper even more than Cray did, especially now that he knows his cousin's dead. The conversation continued for another few minutes, providing Elias with intelligence that confirmed his worst fears about the scope of the vendetta against him. This wasn't just about Marcus and Cray Dutton. It was apparently part of a larger network of Confederate veterans and their descendants who'd spent 20 years tracking down specific Union soldiers for elimination. A secret war that had continued long after Appomattox, fought in shadows and silence by men who refused to accept that the conflict had ended. But that knowledge would have to wait for later consideration. Right now, 4 immediate threats were clustered around a dying campfire, discussing plans that would bring even more killers to Dead Man's Hollow within the week. The tactical situation was clear, the necessity obvious, and the means available to him well within his capabilities. All that remained was the execution, and 20 years hadn't dulled Longshot Boone's efficiency when lives hung in the balance. The first man died without a sound, Elias's knife sliding between his ribs from behind, while a hand clamped over his mouth to prevent any outcry. The second fell moments later, his throat opened by a blade that moved with surgical precision in the darkness. By the time the remaining 2 outlaws realized they were under attack, half their number was already dead, and their killer was advancing with the inexorable patience of death itself. The third man managed to draw his pistol, but never got the chance to fire it, going down with steel between his shoulder blades before he could shout a warning or squeeze his trigger. The 4th and final survivor tried to run, but found his escape blocked by a ghost who'd spent 4 years learning every possible way to kill efficiently and quietly. When the work was finished, Elias Boone stood alone among the bodies of men who'd thought themselves safe in the darkness, 4 more deaths to add to his tally, 4 more souls sent into whatever judgment awaited beyond the grave. But this time there was no bugle call to mark the end of battle, no flag to justify the killing, no cause greater than survival to balance against the weight of what he'd done. As the first pale light of dawn touched the eastern peaks, Longshot Boone began the long walk back to his ranch, carrying with him the knowledge that the war would never truly be over as long as hatred lived in human hearts. Tomorrow would bring new decisions, new dangers, and the certainty that peace was a luxury he could no longer afford to believe in. 3 days after the night raid that eliminated Dutton's survivors, the expected reinforcements arrived in Dead Man's Hollow like a plague of locusts descending on fertile ground. Elias had been watching the eastern approach since dawn, his field glasses focused on the ridge where dust clouds announced the arrival of Jake Dutton and his 8 hired killers from Colorado. The family resemblance was unmistakable even at a distance. Jake sat his horse with the same arrogant confidence that had marked his dead cousin, radiating the casual menace of a man accustomed to taking what he wanted through violence. But this time, Longshot Boone was ready for them in ways that went far beyond tactical preparation. The intervening days had been spent not just in planning defensive positions and escape routes, but in coming to terms with what he'd become and what he'd always been beneath the peaceful facade of 20 years. The rancher who'd tried to build a quiet life in the mountains was gone, burned away like morning mist before the sun, leaving only the cold, professional killer who'd earned his reputation in the blood and smoke of a dozen Civil War battlefields. The transformation hadn't been easy or comfortable, but it had been necessary. Men like the Duttons understood only one language, the dialect of violence spoken with bullets and blades, and trying to reason with them was like attempting to negotiate with hungry wolves. They'd come to Dead Man's Hollow seeking revenge for deaths that occurred 20 years ago, and they wouldn't be satisfied with anything less than Elias Boone's body cooling in the Montana dirt. From his concealed position in a cluster of boulders 500 yards from his cabin, Elias studied the approaching riders through his telescopic sight. 9 men total, all armed with modern repeating rifles and riding horses that showed the stamina and breeding of animals chosen for war rather than ranch work. These weren't desperate outlaws or opportunistic bandits, they were professional killers who'd honed their skills during 2 decades of hunting Union veterans across the frontier territories. Jake Dutton rode at the center of the formation, his gray hat marking him as clearly as a battle flag. Even through the telescope, Elias could see the cold calculation in his eyes, the measuring gaze of a predator sizing up terrain and angles before committing to an attack. This one had learned from his cousin's mistakes, approaching with the caution of someone who understood exactly what kind of enemy he was facing. The riders spread out as they descended into the valley, their movements coordinated and professional. No wild charges or desperate rushes, just the methodical deployment of experienced fighters who'd done this kind of work before. They knew about Longshot Boone's capabilities, had probably studied accounts of the original battle, and planned their approach accordingly. This would be a chess match played with bullets and bodies, each move calculated to counter the legendary sniper's advantages. But Elias had advantages they couldn't have anticipated, starting with his intimate knowledge of every rock, tree, and shadow in Dead Man's Hollow. 20 years of living on this land had taught him where the wind patterns shifted, where echoes would confuse the direction of gunfire, and which routes would provide concealment for movement between positions. They might have studied reports of his tactics, but they'd never fought him on ground of his own choosing. The second advantage was psychological. They expected to face the Longshot Boone of Civil War legend, the methodical sniper who picked off targets from fixed positions at extreme range. They wouldn't be prepared for what he'd become during 3 days of preparation and self-examination, something harder and more ruthless than the soldier who'd fought for the Union. A killer refined by 20 years of mountain solitude into an instrument of perfect lethality. Jake Dutton called a halt when his men reached the same position where his cousin had delivered the original ultimatum. Through his rifle scope, Elias could see the family resemblance clearly now. The same angular jaw, the same cold eyes that showed no more emotion than winter ice. But where Cray had carried himself with the swagger of a bully, Jake possessed the controlled stillness of a professional gunfighter who'd survived by being faster and smarter than everyone he'd ever faced. Longshot Boone. Jake's voice carried clearly across the distance, pitched to project authority and menace in equal measure. "I'm Jake Dutton, cousin to Cray and uncle to Marcus, both of whom you murdered in cold blood. I've come to settle accounts for my family, and I ain't leaving till one of us is feeding the vultures." Elias didn't respond, partly because he was too far away to be heard clearly, but mostly because he'd learned during the war that psychological pressure worked both ways. Let Jake wonder where he was hiding. Let the uncertainty eat at his confidence and force him to make the first move. Patience was still a sniper's greatest weapon, and time favored the defender in situations like this. Minutes passed in tense silence as Jake's men took positions around the cabin and outbuildings, their rifles trained on windows and doorways where they expected their quarry to appear. But the buildings were empty, had been empty since the first attack, and their careful deployment was nothing more than an elaborate theatrical performance for an absent audience. It was Jake himself who first realized they were shadowboxing with ghosts. His head came up like a wolf testing the wind, and even at 500 yards, Elias could see the moment when understanding dawned in those cold eyes. The legendary sniper wasn't cowering in his cabin like a rabbit in its warren. He was out here somewhere in the rocks and brush, watching them through his telescopic sight, waiting for the perfect moment to begin the killing. "He ain't in the cabin." "Boys," Jake called to his men, his voice carrying a new edge of respect for his opponent's tactical thinking. "Spread out and start checking the high ground. Remember what happened to Cray. This old bastard likes to shoot down from elevation. So watch them rocks and keep your eyes peeled for muzzle flash." The deployment that followed was textbook infantry tactics, executed with the precision of men who'd learned their trade in the hardest school imaginable. They moved in pairs, covering each other's advance, using available terrain to mask their movements while maintaining overlapping fields of fire. If Elias had been a normal rancher with a hunting rifle and basic marksmanship skills, their approach would have been unstoppable, but Longshot Boone had never been normal, and the Springfield rifle in his hands was far more than a basic hunting weapon. As the first pair of hunters began working their way up the southern slope, Elias made his opening move in what would be the final game between the Dutton family and the ghost sniper who'd destroyed their dreams of revenge. The shot echoed across Dead Man's Hollow like thunder rolling down from the peaks, and the lead hunter, a bearded man with a Confederate cavalry saber hanging from his belt, dropped like a stone with a bullet through his heart. His partner dove for cover behind a boulder, but not before Elias had marked his position and calculated the angles for a flanking shot that would come. Later in the engagement, Jake Dutton's response was immediate and professional. Instead of panicking or rushing toward the sound of gunfire, he began coordinating his remaining men with hand signals and whispered commands. They'd rehearsed this kind of situation, planned for the possibility of taking casualties while closing with their target. 8 men against 1, even if that one was Longshot Boone, still represented favorable odds for experienced killers who understood how to work as a team. But favorable odds could shift quickly when the enemy held the high ground and knew exactly where you were while remaining invisible himself. As the second shot rang out and another of Jake's men fell to precision rifle fire, the psychological dynamic began to change. The hunters were becoming the hunted, forced to advance across killing ground while a phantom marksman picked them off at his leisure. The third shot took down the man who'd been covering behind the boulder, Elias having worked his way to a flanking position that negated his cover completely. 3 men dead in less than 2 minutes, and Jake Dutton's carefully planned assault was beginning to unravel like cheap rope under strain. Close with him, Jake roared, abandoning subtlety for the desperate gamble of an all-out charge. "He can't reload fast enough to get us all." It was the same mistake Confederate commanders had made repeatedly during the war, assuming that superior numbers could overcome superior position and marksmanship through sheer audacity. Sometimes it worked when the defenders were green troops or poorly equipped militia, but it had never worked against Longshot Boone, whose ability to reload and fire under pressure had become legendary among both Union and Confederate. Forces who'd witnessed it firsthand, the 4th and 5th shots, came so close together they almost sounded like a single report. 2 more of Jake's killers dropping before they'd covered half the distance to Elias's position. The survivors were wavering now, their charge faltering as they realized that closing with their target meant crossing a gauntlet where every step might be their last. Only Jake Dutton himself seemed immune to the fear that was beginning to paralyze his men. He continued advancing up the slope with grim determination, his rifle ready and his eyes scanning the rocks for any sign of muzzle flash that might reveal his enemy's position. This was personal for him in ways that went beyond money or professional reputation. It was about family honor, about settling a debt that had been 20 years in the making. As the distance closed to 300 yards, then 200, Elias found himself facing the same choice that had haunted him since the war ended. He could kill Jake Dutton easily, put a bullet through his heart just as he'd done to Marcus and Cray, completing the circle of vengeance that had brought so much blood to Dead Man's Hollow. But killing Jake would only create new enemies, new cycles of revenge that might continue for generations. The moment of decision arrived when Jake Dutton reached 100 yards from Elias's position, close enough that their eyes met across the killing ground that separated them. In that instant, 20 years of accumulated hatred and grief crashed together like storm fronts, and both men understood that everything that had happened since Gettysburg had led inevitably to this confrontation between the last survivors of a war that refused to end. Jake was wounded, blood seeping from a graze across his left shoulder, where Elias's 6th shot had come close enough to tear cloth and skin without inflicting mortal damage. But the wound hadn't slowed him down. If anything, it seemed to have focused his rage into something pure and incandescent, a fury that burned away fear and doubt and left only the terrible clarity of a man who no longer cared whether he lived or died. 20 years I've been hunting you, Boone, Jake shouted as he took cover behind a weathered pine stump. 20 years of following stories and rumors, tracking down every Union sniper who served in the Army of the Potomac. You want to know how many innocent men I killed because I thought they might be you? Elias didn't answer, but he could guess. The post-war years had been hard on veterans from both sides, and a man with Jake Dutton's skills and connections could have eliminated dozens of former soldiers without attracting much official attention. The frontier was full of unmarked graves containing men who'd simply disappeared, while trying to build new lives far from the battlefields that had shaped them. 12 men, Jake continued, his voice carrying across the distance like an accusation. 12 Union veterans who had the misfortune to match your general description and carry rifles that might have been used at Gettysburg. I put bullets in every one of them, Boone, and their blood is on your hands just as much as mine. The revelation hit Elias like a physical blow. 12 innocent men dead because Jake Dutton had been hunting the ghost of Longshot Boone. 12 families destroyed by a vendetta that had metastasized from personal grief into something approaching madness. The cycle of violence that began with Marcus Dutton's death had claimed at least 24 lives now, and it showed no signs of ending until every Dutton was dead or every person who'd wronged them had paid the ultimate price. But understanding the scope of the tragedy also clarified what had to happen next. This couldn't be allowed to continue, couldn't be passed down to another generation of Duttons who would inherit the family hatred along with everything else their elders left behind. The cycle had to be broken here in Dead Man's Hollow, even if breaking it required sacrifices that went against every instinct Elias possessed. I remember your nephew, Elias called back, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. Marcus Dutton, 5th Virginia Infantry. He died well, Jake. died charging toward our lines with more courage than most men possess. If it helps any, he didn't suffer. The bullet took him clean through the heart. For a moment, Jake's rifle wavered as emotion threatened to overwhelm the cold discipline that had kept him alive through 2 decades of violence. But then his jaw hardened again, and the weapon came back up with renewed purpose. "Don't you dare speak his name," Jake snarled. "Don't you pretend like you remember him as anything more than another target in your telescopic sight. You killed him like he was nothing more than a rabid dog that needed putting down." "I killed him because it was war," Elias replied, shifting position as he spoke to prevent Jake from pinpointing his location by voice alone. Same reason Confederate snipers killed Union boys who were just as young and brave as Marcus. War turns good men into killers, Jake, but it doesn't have to last forever. Jake's response was a burst of rifle fire that chewed splinters from the rocks around Elias's position. The sound of multiple shots indicating he'd switched to a repeating weapon designed for close-range fighting. The psychological warfare was over. Now it would be settled with bullets and blood, the same way everything had been settled since the first shot was fired at Fort Sumter. But as Elias prepared to return fire, movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. 2 of Jake's surviving men were working their way around the southern face of the outcrop, using the distraction of their leader's assault to gain position for a flanking attack. Good tactics from men who understood that pinning an enemy in place, while others maneuvered for advantage, was often the key to victory in small unit engagements. The 7th shot from Elias's rifle took down the lead flanker as he exposed himself crossing a narrow ledge, sending him tumbling 40 feet to crash among the rocks below. But the second man had found better cover, and his return fire forced Elias to duck as bullets whined off granite inches from his head. Now, the tactical situation had changed dramatically. Instead of picking off enemies at long range from a secure position, Elias found himself engaged in a close-quarters firefight with multiple opponents who were coordinating their movements to trap him in a crossfire. The advantages of elevation and concealment were meaningless if he couldn't use them without exposing himself to flanking fire from determined enemies who'd learned to work as a team. The solution came from lessons learned during some of the war's most desperate battles, when outnumbered Union forces had been forced to abandon defensive positions and rely on mobility and aggression to survive. Instead of remaining static and allowing his enemies to dictate the terms of engagement, Elias made the tactical decision that had saved his life a dozen times during 4 years of fighting. He went on the offensive. The transformation was instantaneous and total. One moment he was Elias Boone, the rancher, pinned down and fighting for survival against overwhelming odds. The next moment, he was Longshot Boone, the phantom sniper, moving through broken terrain like death itself made manifest. 20 years of mountain living had taught him every foot of this ground, every shadow and crevice that could provide concealment or passage. He came up behind the flanker from an angle that should have been impossible. Having traversed 50 yards of vertical rock face in complete silence, while the man's attention was focused on the position where he expected his target to remain trapped. The knife that ended the engagement was the same blade that had served him during night raids behind Confederate lines. Its steel still keen despite 2 decades of peaceful retirement. Jake Dutton realized his tactical situation had collapsed when his flanker's rifle fell silent without explanation. The remaining survivors of his original force, 3 men, including himself, were now facing an enemy who'd proven capable of moving through terrain like a hunting cat while picking off targets with supernatural precision. The hunted had become the hunter, and the psychological advantage had shifted completely. "Fall back to the horses," Jake shouted, abandoning his assault in favor of a fighting withdrawal that might save what remained of his command. But retreat across open ground, while pursued by Longshot Boone, was only marginally less dangerous than advancing against him. And the surviving hired guns were beginning to understand that they'd been doomed from the moment they rode into Dead Man's Hollow. The 8th shot caught one of them as he broke cover, spinning him around before dropping him face first in the dust. The ninth and final shot ended the military career of the last surviving hired gun, leaving only Jake Dutton alive among the force that had arrived with such confidence 3 hours earlier. But instead of finishing what he'd started, Elias made a choice that surprised them both. Instead of putting a bullet through Jake Dutton's heart, he called out from his concealed position among the rocks, "It's over, Jake. Your men are all dead, and you're outnumbered and outgunned. But it doesn't have to end the same way for you." Jake's bitter laughter echoed across the valley. "You offering me terms, Boone? After everything that's happened between our families?" "I'm offering you a choice," Elias replied. "You can keep fighting a war that ended 20 years ago, or you can help me end it for good. Your call." The silence that followed stretched long enough for both men to consider the weight of what was being offered and what accepting or refusing might mean for whatever future either of them might have left. 6 months later, Elias Boone stood on the same porch where Cray Dutton had delivered his ultimatum, watching the morning sun climb over peaks that no longer seemed to harbor ghosts from wars long ended. The valley had healed from the violence that had scarred it, grass growing green over the graves, where 18 men lay buried beneath simple wooden crosses. Sherman dozed at his feet, grey muzzle resting on crossed paws. The old dog finally at peace after months of vigilant watching for enemies who would never come. The conversation with Jake Dutton that day had lasted 3 hours, 2 broken men sitting in the shade of a pine tree, while they tried to find some way forward that didn't involve more killing. What emerged wasn't forgiveness, some wounds cut too deep for that kind of healing, but rather a weary understanding that revenge was a poison that destroyed the avenger as surely as the target. Jake had ridden away from Dead Man's Hollow that evening, carrying his cousin's Confederate medallion and a promise that the vendetta would end with their generation. Whether that promise would hold remained to be seen. But Elias had done what he could to ensure it. The letter he'd written to Jake's surviving relatives in Virginia had been painfully honest about the deaths of Marcus and Cray Dutton, accepting responsibility while explaining the circumstances that had led to each killing. He'd included a bank draft for $5,000, most of his savings accumulated over 20 years of ranching, along with an offer to sell his property and send the proceeds to help support Marcus's widow and children if they were still living. The response had arrived 2 weeks later, written in a woman's careful script on paper edged with black mourning bands. Ellen Dutton, Marcus's wife, had remarried after the war and was now living quietly in Richmond with her 2 children and her second husband. She wanted no part of her first husband's family's vendetta, had spent 20 years trying to forget the war that had taken away the boy she'd loved. The money was returned with a note that said simply, "Let the dead rest in peace." But Jake Dutton had kept his word in ways that went beyond simply abandoning his personal quest for revenge. 3 weeks after their confrontation, Elias had received a package containing detailed information about the network of Confederate veterans who'd been hunting Union soldiers across the frontier territories. Names, locations, methods, everything Jake knew about the shadow war that had been fought in silence since Appomattox. The information had been forwarded to federal marshals in Denver and San Francisco, leading to arrests that finally ended a campaign of assassination that had claimed dozens of innocent lives. The cost of that peace had been high, measured not just in the 18 bodies buried in Dead Man's Hollow, but in the weight of choices that would follow Elias for whatever years he had left. He'd killed 11 men in 3 days, more than a quarter of his Civil War total, and each death had been as personal as anything he'd experienced during 4 years of military service. These hadn't been anonymous enemies glimpsed through a telescopic sight. They'd been men whose voices he'd heard, whose faces he'd seen clearly, whose final moments he'd witnessed at close range. The nightmares had returned with a vengeance. Decades of carefully suppressed memories breaking free to torment his sleep with visions of battlefields both old and recent. But this time he wasn't facing them alone. Dr. Margaret Sullivan, The territorial physician who traveled between settlements, providing medical care to isolated communities, had become a regular visitor to Dead Man's Hollow. Their relationship had begun. Professionally, she'd come to examine the bodies and provide official documentation for the territorial authorities, but had evolved into something deeper as she recognized the toll that violence had taken on his spirit. Margaret understood trauma in ways that most frontier doctors never learned, having served as a nurse during the final year of the war before pursuing medical training in Chicago. She'd seen enough broken soldiers to recognize the signs of a man wrestling with the moral weight of necessary killing, and she possessed both the clinical knowledge and personal compassion needed to help him navigate the difficult process of healing. Their conversations on long summer evenings had become a form of therapy that no medical textbook could have prescribed. Margaret listened without judgment as Elias worked through the events that had brought violence back into his life, helping him understand that surviving didn't require forgetting, and that peace wasn't the same thing as the absence of conflict. Some battles had to be fought if they were going to end properly, and some kinds of peace could only be purchased with blood. The practical changes to his life had been just as significant as the emotional ones. Word of what had happened in Dead Man's Hollow had spread throughout the territory, carried by federal marshals, supply merchants, and the few surviving outlaws who'd witnessed Longshot Boone's return to action. The reputation that followed those stories was both blessing and curse. Criminals gave his ranch a wide berth, but so did most honest folks who weren't sure what to make of a legendary killer who'd chosen to live among them. But there were exceptions. Men who understood the difference between necessary violence and casual brutality. Tom McKinnon, a Union veteran who'd lost his left arm at Shiloh, had arrived in late summer looking for work and a chance to start over after his wife's death from consumption. He'd proven to be an excellent ranch hand, despite his disability, and more importantly, he was someone Elias could talk to about the war, without having to explain why certain sounds made him reach for weapons that weren't there. The cattle operation had expanded modestly, growing from 200 head to nearly 300, as Elias reinvested the profits from his beef sales into better breeding stock and improved pastures. Tom's experience with livestock had been invaluable in implementing changes that increased both the quantity and quality of their annual output. More importantly, having a partner meant that the burden of constant vigilance could be shared, allowing both men to sleep more soundly than either had managed alone. But the most significant change was the one that couldn't be measured in dollars or counted in head of cattle. Elias Boone had finally made peace with Longshot Boone, accepting that the sniper and the rancher were different aspects of the same man rather than separate identities at war with each other. The skills that had made him deadly during the war were also what had enabled him to protect innocent people from predators like the Dutton gang. Violence was a tool like any other, morally neutral until directed by human choice toward either construction or destruction. On quiet mornings like this one, as he watched his cattle graze in pastures watered by streams that ran clear and cold from mountain snowpack, Elias could almost believe that he'd finally found the peace that had eluded him since Appomattox. The ghosts were still there, they always would be, but they no longer controlled his days or tormented his nights. The war was finally over, not because the killing had stopped, but because he'd learned to live with what he'd done and who he'd been forced to become. Sherman stirred at his feet, lifting his grizzled head to test the morning breeze for scents that might indicate visitors or trouble. But the only smells carried on the wind were sage and pine, wildflowers, and the distant promise of rain from clouds building over the western peaks. The old dog settled back into his doze, satisfied that all was well in the valley that had become their sanctuary. In the distance, Tom McKinnon was moving cattle to fresh pasture, his commands to the herd carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. Margaret would arrive before noon to share lunch and discuss plans for the small hospital she wanted to establish in Copper Falls, where her medical skills could serve the growing population of settlers and miners who were transforming the territory from wilderness into civilization. These were good problems to have, the kinds of challenges that built communities rather than destroyed them. As Elias Boone sat on his porch in the growing warmth of a Montana summer morning, surrounded by the life he'd fought so hard to preserve, he finally understood what peace actually meant. It wasn't the absence of conflict, it was the presence of something worth fighting for when conflict became unavoidable. The war was over at last, and Longshot Boone could finally rest.